Hello dear listeners. I hope like me that you're multitasking while you listen to this video because I'm making this entrance into YouTube not as an expert but simply as a voice in discussion. In fact, this particular video is a discharge of my debt to a person who helped me form myself as a Catholic, as well as a debt to anyone else whom this man could also help. The debt of gratitude, as St. Thomas Aquinas spoke of it in the second part of the Summa Theologica, entails discharging honor and reverence to a benefactor, someone who has given us particular and private favors. We are obliged to such a person to offer him assistance or support, perhaps if the situation requires it, but definitely always to honor and revere him. So even though perhaps this is not going to be the best defense, it is one I feel obliged to discharge. And secondly, the debt, I feel a debt of charity towards my fellow Roman Catholics. I don't want them to deprive themselves of a boon, of an assistance that I received that could also be helpful to them as well. It's something that I don't wish anyone to be deprived of. So, proceeding then. This is a talk concerning the integrity of Father Malachy Martin. Father Malachy as he would introduce himself to friends, or Father Malachi Martin as he would introduce himself to the typical English speaker. He was always cosmopolitan enough to know what someone from a different culture would prefer to say. I have received great benefits from his works, particularly the Bernard Jansen interviews, which I believe are available from Triumph Communications and I heartily recommend, but also from his factional novels concerning geopolitics and politics in the church. And I feel a bit of an obligation to defend him as well against criticism which is not very well founded. Now, I don't like the term traditional Catholic. We are simply Catholic. Full stop. But as a matter of identification, those of us who wish to be as orthodox as possible and to engage in orthopraxis as much as possible are usually identified as traditionalists by others, and out of a decent label we call ourselves traditionalists as well. There are old traditionalists and there are new traditionalists, by virtue of which neither is better than the other. But those of us who have been in the traditional movement for a long time, 21 years in my case, can sometimes perhaps pass the boon of experience off to those who have just entered it. This video is rather prompted by a conversation between Dr. Taylor Marshall and Mr. Timothy Gordon about the trustworthiness of Father Malachy Martin. I'm very sorry if Timothy Gordon has a title as well. I'm a mother. I don't have time to check absolutely everything, which apparently they don't either. I don't wish to be harsh on these two men. I greatly enjoy their talks, very much. But they set themselves up as arbiters of a question. Can Malachy Martin be trusted? Without doing very in-depth research on the matter, as the comment section of that video will show you. I'm not sure why they didn't have a devil's advocate to their position on the video to discuss the matter with them. It wasn't perfect, and perhaps they would even agree with me that it wasn't perfect. But it did awaken me to the possibility that new traditionalists perhaps lack the humility or the wider understanding of the political situation in the church. And that, even more than my debt of gratitude to Father Malachy Martin, has prompted me to make this video. One of the things I don't think they understand is that there was a time when Pope Benedict's motu proprio did not exist, when cardinals and bishops were telling laymen that no, you do not have the right to attend the old form of the Mass. It has been abrogated, and it is schism to attend this without the express permission of the bishop. Thomas Aquinas College, the school that I attended, before the motu proprio, was only allowed one such Mass a month, which they obeyed as the directive from Cardinal Mahony at the time. And because of our own position as, I suppose, moral cowards, Catholics were inclined to believe that was true. They told us that the Society of Pius X was schismatic. We believed it. I remember listening to a debate between E. Michael Jones and Michael Davies regarding whether the society was in schism. I took it for granted as a young teenager that they were in schism. And I remember how my heart palpitated when Michael Davies won that debate. It was very unnerving for me to realize that I had had a very clericalist understanding of how the church worked. I wasn't even convinced by his perfectly clear arguments. I just assumed that Michael Davies was a better debater and that somehow he had to be wrong. Hardly the right mentality to adopt to be a truly liberally thinking person in the classical sense, of course. So we cowered in fear for the hierarchy, which caused so many people to abhor both the traditional movement and even the church's traditional teachings. It caused people to set themselves up as a judge of former pontiffs and the past, and hence of the church herself. People who believed in Pascal's wager, better to be on the safe side than to try to love God as he is, better not to risk anything. Many of these people were turned away from the traditional movement because of this attitude. Those of us who did cling to the old traditions of the church, the immemorial traditions of the church, we relied on experts like Canon Hess, Michael Davies, Father Hardon, Father Malachy Martin, to keep us afloat. The new traditionalists have not undergone this trial yet of adhering to the faith when a powerful churchman is telling you to abandon it. They have not yet endured this trial. So it's important for them not to entirely dismiss these people that were helping us cling to tradition when it was so hard to do so, especially the confused of us. These men are not to be dismissed outright. Now, concerning the human factor as well as the doctrinal factor, which was something that people like Father Malachy Martin could boil down very simply to ease our consciences about attending a Latin Mass. The human factor was his charisma, which is not an argument for trustworthiness by any means, but we must not make it an automatic disqualification. Charisma is a very important thing. It is a gift that God gives to certain people to help his fellow man. And it's very easy for traditionalists to get angry when we think of injustices and how the church has been ravaged by the modernists. It's easy to get very angry and very critical about it. Father Malachy Martin had a way of sweeping you away from the present onto the plane that he called et alia, Romanitas, the long view, the eternal view. He had the way of reminding us, as one of his characters mentioned in Windswept House, the real battle has already been won for us. The battle that remains right now is to save our souls, and as far as God ordains to help save the souls of individuals around us. As Father Malachy Martin said so many times, the only victory of the Church is a soul that dies and goes to heaven. His charismatic way of speaking of these truths, his beautiful prose and his eloquence reminded us of what we loved rather than what we abhorred. That's an important thing to remember. Also, this spirit of love that he brought with him wherever he went. Too many people only want to reach out to the kinds of persons that they like. Whereas in Jesus Christ's parable of the prodigal son, the father reached out to both the prodigal son and the elder frugal son. He wanted both of them in the church. He wasn't ready to lose either of them. Dr. Taylor Marshall and Timothy Gordon rather disparagingly remarked on Father Malachi Martin's appearance on the Art Bell show, because Art Bell is a nut, because he is a conspiracy theorist. May I ask why Father Malachy Martin shouldn't want the conversion of Art Bell? Why shouldn't he want that? Doesn't a priest need to speak to the Art Bells of the world? The rather saintly Father Charles Fiore once recounted how he was walking down the street in New York with Father Malachy, and a man from a taxi said, "Hey, Father," recognizing the collar on Father Fiore. Father Fiore returned the greeting respectfully, but Father Malachy Martin said, "Let's go talk to him." They went and they talked to the man. The man noticed the rosary hanging out of Father Malachy's pocket and said, "Oh, I used to have one of those." He revealed himself as a man who had had the benefit of the sacraments, but was not availing himself of one of the Church's greatest sacramentals. Father Malachy immediately handed over the rosary to the man. Because he was interested in this person from whom he could hope to derive no advantage, he perhaps recalled that man to a deeper life in Christ, to deeper devotion, to ways that could save his soul. Father Malachy would talk to anybody and everybody, including the kooks, including the mainstream people in our current culture, including to people hostile to him. Even though Father Malachy's abilities were greatly impaired by the time he appeared on the Art Bell show, he had suffered several strokes. There was a moment in one interview where a very angry Protestant, a very anti-Catholic Protestant, called in. In a matter of minutes, Father Malachy Martin had turned a rabid man into a puppy. Another reason to appear on the Art Bell show, it exposed him to someone to whom he could actually reach out to. Touching on that, on Father Malachy's impaired abilities on the Art Bell show, there was a reference to his kookiness made by Dr. Taylor Marshall in the last years of his life. I was a bit offended by that at first until I realized that perhaps Dr. Marshall had not done his homework. Father Malachy Martin was a stroke victim, I believe several times. At the time of his death, he was on blood thinners, which is perhaps what caused the bleeding in his brain after his fall. And yes, he had said some disturbing things, but for anyone who has had either personal or professional experience with stroke victims, that's one of the tragedies of having a stroke. The person's never quite the same again. even if they don't slur their speech, even if their face shows no signs of what happened, they will be having perhaps a normal conversation with you, and suddenly they lose the thread of their thought and perhaps weep, or suddenly they say something so strange without even being aware of it. It's possible that this is what was happening on the Art Bell show. I am sure that this was what was happening on the Art Bell show, because if Father Malachy Martin is really as cunning as his detractors portray him to be, he would never have said or done many of the things he did in the last years of his life. Being well acquainted with the ravages of a stroke via people I love, I'm not going to judge him for the last few years of his life. There are, however, very serious cases made against Father Malachy Martin's character. One of them being the documentation of his complete laicization, and honestly, I personally distrust this documentation because Father Vincent O'Keefe, a former Vicar General of the Jesuit order, confirmed Father Malachy Martin's version of the dispensation of his vows of poverty and obedience. And also because of Father Malachy's own very audacious claims regarding the matter. He had many detractors during his lifetime, but he often said they're just throwing mud because they have nothing else to throw. I think if this documentation was legitimate, I'm convinced it would have come out before his death. The hierarchy had every reason to be afraid of Father Malachy Martin, and they chose not to attack until after he was gone. I know this is not a conclusive defense, but I do think it's reason for doubt concerning the matter. And since we are not arguing for his canonization, and since he is dead and no longer dispensing sacraments, for me this is enough. Concerning the accusations of affairs with women, the loudest accuser is a man who cannot be trusted. Robert Kaiser. He is, his own colleagues have said that he is a man who doesn't know the difference between truth and reality. In his book, Clerical Error, he admits to unfounded superstitions on his part. He admits to being incarcerated in a mental institution. He is not a reliable narrator, especially given his own very strange obsession with Father Malachy Martin, his strange erotic dreams about the man, and the odd way he describes him in the Irish documentary Hostage to the Devil, which, by the way, is a secular documentary, not a religious one. So the loudest accuser is a man not to be trusted. That said, Father Malachy Martin has written of a situation in his great novel Vatican. If you wish to understand many of the financial scandals that rocked the church, I highly recommend this novel to understand it. The priest protagonist does have a very close friendship with a woman who seems to resemble Mary Kaiser, a relationship which is a friendship of a very deep sort, which in the end they do not consummate. I have to say, it was one of the most suspenseful moments I've ever encountered in literature, where it seemed like they might, these two characters of course, might commit a great sin together. Father Malachy Martin speaks on the consequences of those sins with such eloquence that give me reason to think that perhaps he knows from personal experience what these consequences are. Did he sin with women? Perhaps. But I do believe in repentance. I think that's what we all believe as Catholics. And even if he came to the United States, not as he put it, fleeing from the excesses of the Jesuit order, which he beautifully documents in his non-fictional work, The Jesuits. Even if he came to the United States in disgrace after this affair, which would be a strange thing to disgrace him in lieu of the many scandals which the church hierarchy has tolerated. There is a phenomenon in human nature that is so common that in literature it's called a trope. The trope is becoming the mask. When someone with ulterior motives takes on the guise of something good, but in the end ends up truly living this life. Humphrey Bogart in The Left Hand of God, and Sir Jorah Mormont in Game of Thrones. There are many other examples of people who were not good in the beginning, adopted the role of a good person, and later actually became that role. If Father Malachy Martin was not sincere in the beginning, I do believe he became sincere through his time. First, by writing as a conservative, and then shaking off the shackles of conservatism for simply being a Roman Catholic. And there is a question concerning the fact that even after his supposed entrance into conservatism, he's still very much writing like a liberal. But I think we have to have some patience for his malformation as a young priest. The fact that he was a Jesuit, the fact that Teilhard de Chardin was controlling so much of the Jesuit spirituality. It's very hard to shake off who you have been taught by in your early years. These people get inside your head and they live inside there, just as Father Malachy Martin, whom I read beginning as a 13-year-old. He's always in my head. I judge so many things in light of the principles he explained. He and Thomas Aquinas stand there as the two judges, helping me formulate so many of my opinions. So I can sympathize with being in error. Even after a supposed realization of the error, I can sympathize with the slow conversion to the right opinion. And I'm sure that this applies to many of our great saints, that past sins damaged their ability to speak wisely on certain issues, that certain prejudices made those things difficult for them. I believe St. Augustine accused himself of this when he had a dream wherein God asked him, "What are you?" He responded, "I am a Christian," whereas God replied, "No, you are a Ciceronian." If St. Augustine of Hippo can make such an accusation against himself, I think that we can charitably forgive the slow conversion of someone who had been formerly steeped in error. I think that Father Malachy Martin's later works in the 80s, his interview with Bernard Jansen in the 90s, are all testament to a genuine conversion, and they were works that helped form a basis of properly understanding the Church that so many modern Catholics were not given in lieu of the Second Vatican Council. Which leads me to the fruits of Father Malachy Martin's tree. By your works ye shall know them. Father Malachy Martin has been vouched for by very good men, such as Canon Hess, Father Fiore, and Father Hardin, excellent men who also were there to support Catholics when when the Vatican had not yet, via Pope Benedict, seen fit to address issues concerning the Society of Pius X, concerning the English translation of the Mass, concerning whether or not the Tridentine Mass had been abrogated. These men were there for us, and so many of them vouched for Father Malachy Martin in their interviews and in their statements. I think that speaks a great deal for him right there. And his books themselves, one of the greatest things they did, as my father pointed out in one of our conversations, is that they broke our hearts slowly. One of the reasons why the scandals did not rock my world when I was 19 is because I had known about them since I was 14. Because Father Malachy Martin, through his faction, was able to delicately introduce these problems in the church. Starting with the Vatican, I think, he introduced the problem of the church's devotion to carnal prudence, to material gains. And he still left the idea open that perhaps not all churchmen were modernists. It was a rather optimistic book. And later came Windswept House, which showed us the worst of those sins. Those of us who had read Vatican were more prepared for the revelations of Windswept House. Those of us who only read Windswept House were prepared for the Fourth Estate's revelations later. What's more, because we had encountered these things through Malachi Martin first, we knew that both the secular world as well as the Vatican was aware of these abuses. So we knew that the secular world had also countenanced these things, that they were perfectly aware of them and had only chosen to reveal them for political reasons at the opportune time. Malachy Martin therefore made us aware of these things because he knew it was the right thing to do, to gradually introduce us to the worst. That was one of his greatest contributions to the church as a whole. And he also gave us the cautionary spirit against too much optimism. He made it clear the limitations of reform that a pope would be able to enact, even if he wanted to. The resignation of the Slavic Pope at the end of Windswept House is, I believe, the same resignation that we have seen with Pope Benedict. Whereas many young conservatives and traditionalists were scandalized and really horrified by that resignation, those who had read Malachy Martin were prepared for it. Those who had read Malachy Martin were prepared for what Pope Francis would do the moment we had heard an announcement that a South American Jesuit who had chosen the name Francis was Pope. We knew exactly what that meant from the beginning. And because of Malachy Martin's guidance, because of his formation, we also immediately knew that it was our own fault for not praying and fasting enough. He always instilled the proper modesty of the laymen towards churchmen, while at the same time making it clear where churchmen were guilty towards their charges, the guilt of the shepherds in charge of the sheep. He did both all the time. So even as the new traditionalists are scandalized and horrified by the slow, seemingly non-existent of reform in the church, those of us who have been formed by Malachy know that we can expect so little of it to happen quickly. We know how to be patient. We know what the obstacles are. And we know that ultimately it all gets back to us having to keep the faith. having to focus on two things: that the victory in the macrocosm has already been won, and the victory in the microcosm is perfectly within our grasp. Not in a Pelagian sense, but in the sense of availing ourselves of the faith that God has given us, practicing it properly, believing properly. It would be a shame for the younger generations not to receive this same formation that Father Malachy gave to us in a beautiful, charismatic, and accurate way. It would be a shame if no one read the Jesuits to learn how this order was corrupted, and thus to know how every order can be corrupted. It would be a shame not to have the work of the Keys of this Blood passed down, an excellent geopolitical history of the capitalist West, the communist East, and the Church of Rome, in light of the strategies of John Paul II. It would be a great shame for that work to be lost for all time. It would be a shame for the factional novels that opened us up to who the enemies of the church were, even in her own hierarchy, and to not benefit from the human trials presented to us in the guise of fiction. I am not qualified to exculpate Father Malachy Martin's character. I'm only qualified to vouch for the integrity of his works. If he was a saint, he deserves our gratitude. If he was a sinner, his great work for us entitles him to our prayers for his salvation. Thank you so much for your time.